There's only 24 hours in a day. I got a pair of earbuds and I wish there was a way that I could know just what I want to listen to. There's 150,000 shows that I'm not sitting through. When the world is dark and boring, let us do your exploring. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Welcome to Pod on Pod, a guide to the world of podcasts because it's not your daddy's radio. We're your hosts.
I'm Josh.
I'm Joel, and thanks for sticking with us even through a week off. Sorry for the missed episode last week. What can I say? My babies do not understand that I have a podcast to record.
Or that they shouldn't get sick.
Indeed, man. But we are back with a vengeance, my friends, and this week we're going to be discussing the Last Gentleman podcast.
Yeah, and you know what, Joel? I was pretty bummed out when we couldn't record last week, but a little thankful too because I've had time to really reflect on what it is we do in the studio.
Well, look at that.
Okay, so whenever you look at the nature of what we want to accomplish, right, and that is to expose new listeners to a plethora, a cornucopia, the world of podcasting, as we say in the intro. And the way that we've chosen to go about doing it is we listen to 3 episodes of a podcast, and then we give our rating, our opinions, our thoughts, our feelings on that podcast as a whole.
Trying to do so even maybe with a flavor of the show.
Right. But that's the convention that we've chosen to do it in. And in this podcast that we're reviewing tonight in particular, it seems a weird way to go about. It's a very ambitious way to go about reviewing a podcast because what you find is that a podcast in episode 1 may not be the same podcast as episode 20, and that form of podcast may not be the same as episode 40. Even though it's the same podcast, the same title, things evolve, things change, people grow.
That's a really great way to put it. And we have discussed before with individual shows that we've reviewed, this is a show that really changes through the course of its history so far. Like you in particular almost always go back and listen to the first episode. And so you've got that context a lot of times. And I'm thinking specific example, like the Martha and Eric podcast,
Yeah.
you talked about how that grew,
Right.
for instance. We've talked about how other shows have evolved a little bit from one specific direction to maybe a broader one or from a broader direction to a very specific niche.
Right, just like
The
the
Bionic
Bionic
Broadcast.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what it is, the Bionic Broadcast. You can hear what their passions are, like, and it's just trying to get them like, hey, you guys are great at this, just do this.
Yeah, I do think one thing that I appreciate about us is that we review shows that have super high distribution and then shows that are very small audience shows, comparatively anyway. And we review those shows in a very similar fashion. We look at them on even ground because that's the way they are presented in the podcast apps or in iTunes, for instance.
Right, but in the way that we do it, we have to brush with very broad strokes.
Yes,
Right,
that's
it would
true.
be as if we just took 3 pieces of Shakespeare. Let's say we pull a sonnet, and let's say we do 2 plays.
A sonnet, Romeo and Juliet, and Twelfth Night.
There we go. And that is all we get to listen to. And that is all we get to read before we have to explain Shakespeare to someone. That's a very ambitious goal, man. It's very ambitious. And currently, I feel like it a little outreaches our talents.
Can I defend us a moment?
Oh, sure.
It's more like if you chose a sonnet, a tragedy, and a comedy, I chose a different sonnet, a different tragedy, and a different comedy, and then we together wrote a paper about Shakespeare to explain it to somebody, or gave a talk to explain Shakespeare to somebody. I think it's closer to that.
And try to explain the breadth and depth of Shakespeare.
Well, but
off
at
of
least
that.
in 6 episodes, because you and I don't listen to the same 3.
Rarely.
Rarely do we have crossover, at least of all 3. So I feel like we do a pretty good job of triangulation. In those cases where there has been tremendous growth or change, I think generally we see that and we discuss it. But again, as our comment section will prove to you on our website, podonpod.com, or our reviews, for instance, in iTunes will prove to you, many people disagree with my opinion on that. Okay. So now, do you think perhaps that we should talk about the actual podcast that we're discussing this week?
Yeah, that was just something like in what we do. Like
I wanted to couch it a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So this week's show is called The Last Gentleman, and this was actually suggested to us by several people. As a matter of fact, we got a kind of a flood of emails just a couple of weeks ago, which is why this has been moved up in the schedule a bit. But I'm going to read this email from Kara. She says, "Hello. First off, I want to say that I found the pod after the shout out you got from Stuff You Should Know. You guys have a great show, great concept, and I've loved every episode. I have one show that is a must for you guys to review, and it's a show that's recorded here in Toronto." So I'm assuming this lady's a Canadian herself. Where I am from, oh, there you go. She gave it away. It's called The Last Gentleman Podcast. This show is amazing. Easily my favorite podcast to date. Hopefully I'm not the only one to suggest this show. Even with Listener Appreciation Month complete, I hope you guys get to this show soon. They have a unique chemistry and are growing very quickly. More and more people I know listen to these guys. They just had Adam Carolla himself call in on the most recent episode, so it shows they are the real deal. Thanks again for the quality work you do. I did listen to that Adam Carolla episode.
Did too.
I also listened to episodes 29 and episode 40. Those are the 3 episodes I
listened
heard.
to the first episode. I listened to the Adam Carolla episode. I listened to the Miss Pat episode. And I listened to another early, because Adam Carolla and Miss Pat were further on.
Yeah, those are some of the most recent ones.
Yeah. And Travis, the producer, actually wrote in with some suggestions for us to check out. And also, he gave some bullet points on his thoughts on the show that I thought were pretty close.
He did. Travis, and we appreciate Travis, first of all, for reaching out to us and discussing it at all. First of all, nobody's ever reviewed me other than, again, those folks in iTunes, and I don't know exactly who they are, so it's a little easier to take them with a grain of salt. But I know it must be a little bit of a nerve-wracking experience, especially these guys. They've had it hanging over their heads for 2 weeks now. But first of all, let's tell you, if you're new to Pod on Pod, we're way into this thing, and you're like, what do you guys even do? We break down a podcast with 4 criteria. Every week we talk about a different show for you, and we talk about audio quality, we talk about host likability, we talk about the content itself, and we talk about production values too. You'll get an idea of whether this is a show that you want to go and do some more research on your own, and we definitely suggest that you do. You can find this show, for instance, you can find these guys at thelastgentlemanpodcast.com. They've got new podcasts every Sunday. Who are they, Josh? Who are our hosts for this show?
Kevin.
Kevin doesn't have a last name?
Kevin has many names.
Yeah, Kevin likes to keep his anonymity. And as soon as I heard that in the show, I couldn't help but chuckle.
I know.
Because I know this guy that used to do a podcast with me as the other guy. And it's you. You used to maintain your anonymity online.
Yeah, so I have some insight on trying to do a podcast anonymously for work reasons.
And the other guy is Jay Brody. He is a co-host on Sirius FM. Yep. Is that only available in Canada? I don't have Sirius FM, so I don't know. Is that only available in Canada?
Did you try to either.
Look at you? There we go. So we're worthless on this issue. But he is a stand-up comic, as is Kevin. Isn't that correct? Isn't he a comedian as well? No, I'm wrong.
Well, he has a comedy podcast.
There you go. He's a little bit of a he's a funny guy, I'll tell you that. Anyway, they are both from Toronto. They are in Canada, or they live in Toronto now anyway. So these are Canadians, and this is a Canadian podcast. If you have a Canadian bias, now's the time to step off the train.
I love Canadians.
I do too. I also like that we have apparently quite a little following in Toronto. We've reviewed some other Canadian podcasts before. In particular, I know the Faculty of Horror is a Canadian podcast. So I am assuming some of that audience was built off of those things. Apparently, Stuff You Should Know is pretty big in north of the border as well.
So there's a couple of issues that I have with the show. Right off, just the type of show it is. Joel, what would you say is the most overcrowded genre of podcasting?
2 white guys talking to each other about the daily events of their lives, random news headlines, and the odd humorous thing that comes up to them.
So early in this podcast's blooming career, it does very little to differentiate itself from any of those other ones. Other than their opinions,
yes,
which is going to be different than everybody else's, obviously, it's still the same type of show as literally hundreds that are out there.
There's nothing inherently wrong with that concept.
I'm not saying there is, or people wouldn't be doing it by the droves.
Sure. You and I fall into lots of those categories at least. And our first podcast was exactly that.
Yes, 100% it was. And whenever I come across one of these, I often look at it from the point of view of this show will evolve. What is it going to evolve to? Does it eventually get there? Or do I have a suggestion for a direction for it to go to? Because you can't sit around and muddle around in that quagmire for very long and keep things interesting. You can't.
Are you looking to become Johnny Pottleseed?
No.
You gonna plant little pod seeds all over the world?
Yeah. So that was one. That was an issue for me to get over from the start.
Okay.
The second is the issue of Kevin. I've done what he's doing, and here's a couple issues that I had with it. So I'm sure that he probably struggles with the same thing. The second that you do a podcast and you are not allowed to be yourself for whatever reason, already you're becoming a character.
Yeah,
and it's hard not. It is almost impossible to not.
This was something, especially towards the end of our old podcast, that you had a more and more of an increasing problem with. You and I would talk about it off the air. Like,
I struggled with it.
I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know where to go, except for the places that it feels like you should go. You end up feeling bad about it afterwards. Like, that's not what I want to say.
Right. So generally, what I did was, I kind of took on more of like what my persona was or how I was in college.
Right.
Which isn't who I grew to be, but those weren't necessarily my views. And I found myself either trying to be extreme one way or extreme the other, whether that's the way that I felt. I try to be polarizing, and you're constantly trying to push the envelope. And in doing that, you take a lot of the you out of it, which is what people want to hear when they listen to a podcast. They want to hear the you.
So we've already sort of talked a little bit about content, but we're bleeding right into host likability. So that's where we're going to start our real meat and potatoes discussion of this podcast right here. But I think what you're saying as we go into host likability, I think what you're saying, because of the nature of the show, because of his choice, Kevin's choice to be anonymous, going by the random last name every time, not connecting it to any online personality,
Right.
not having to quote unquote own any of his statements or ideas,
Right.
that he's pushing himself to be a more combative and a less likable host naturally.
Right. It's going to happen. Because once you take your identity out of it, and that's essentially what you're doing when you're anonymous. When you take your identity out of it, you take that id out, something's going to fill it. And it's going to become a caricature of what you think that host should do.
Well, especially in a setup where you and I are trying to entertain whoever's listening to this
Right.
thing.
Yes.
And
you push real hard.
Yes, and it's not like it's scripted. So this is
Right.
it's extemporaneous. It was just off the top of our heads. And so if you say a thing, of course I will say whatever is most interesting to be in response to that, even if it's outlandish and perhaps offensive.
And I'm not saying
that's
there
a good call on your part.
And I'm not saying there aren't people out there that can't be fabulous at it. I wasn't one of those people. I couldn't do it. And it just seems like as I listened through the progression of this show, whether he's realized it or not, it seems like that's an issue for Kevin too.
When did Travis come in exactly? Do you know?
I'm not
Neither one of
sure.
us heard that episode in particular, so we're not positive. But there was a definite difference that is made by having the third party involved. And I mean, we can pat Travis on the back specifically. I'm not saying that the two guys weren't doing a good job without him, but you and I would benefit, I think, in the same way.
Oh, tremendously.
By having just one more head to look at things.
So I'm not saying that Kevin's tone or point of view changed, but the bombasticness of it did. Like early on, it was like there's some heinous stuff coming out in it that I think was an attempt to be funny, but may have crossed a line or may not have come off the way that he wanted it to.
I didn't even really consider the anonymity considered to like the offensive comedy and stuff necessarily. And by the way, we haven't mentioned it, but I should say this show is an explicit podcast. Yeah. I think that went without saying when we were talking about things kind of over the line and offensive comedy, for instance. But going back over it in my head, the things that I actually was like, oh wow, I can't believe they said that. It was almost always Kevin that did it, not Jay. Even though Jay was stumbling into the same offensive comedic ideas and stuff, but the really over the line statements, the ones that even I was taken aback at from time to time, they were almost always from Kevin. I didn't really think about it.
Well,
because
whenever you look at it, whenever you look at first, it is always not hard. I'm going to do it every podcast that I listen to that have two male hosts. I always think which one is Joel and which one is me. And in this case, it was very obvious that I was Kevin. And the dynamic is you're going to have a straight man that tries to keep things on track, and then you're going to have the clown.
Sure.
Those two personas are generally going to be the two that are there.
Having not heard the serious show that Jay is a member of, I'm going to assume that he is the humorous and hilarious sidekick on that show.
Really?
Yes. I bet he is a smaller part of the show, and maybe even like the full-time sidekick.
He's taking pot shots.
Yes, he is the sniper from the side, and this is his time to shine and to grow as that solo host. That's definitely the impression that I get. He does a pretty good job of it too. As far like for the outlandish conversations that they have, for the loosey-goosey nature of their format, he does keep things moving about as well as you could imagine too. And we haven't said this either, but these guys both have a pretty nice and pleasant speaking voices. So overall, I like Jay just fine. Jay Brody, that is. Kevin, the anonymous one, I did not care for, only because, and I don't know, maybe it shows my bleeding heart liberal nature, but like a lot of the misogyny, the racial jokes, like all that stuff, I can't, it's not funny to me anymore. It goes over the top and I can't, it hurts my feelings, you know?
What he's doing is very hard. What Kevin's doing is very hard to do, and it's even harder to do when you take the you out of it.
I think that's the exact button that we needed to put on it. There you go. That's about as well as we could put it. Let's move forward. So that's host likability. Let's talk about audio quality. These guys record a good show. Studio setup, I'm sure they're in the same room, right?
What I thought was funny is you didn't listen to the first episode.
No, I did not.
The first episode is not the quality that the later episodes are. And then obviously later on it was it definitely...
He improved.
Yes.
Or that studio improved, or whatever their process was.
Maybe they got different mics, whatever it was, but the audio quality definitely improves. Again, this whole podcast improves the further it goes, which is exciting. You know what I love? I love it when they do a Canadian accent of another region.
Oh, really? When they make fun of the Hicks of Canada?
I love it. Because it would be the same thing as you or I doing a Cajun accent, right? Like, yeah, our Cajun accent's not going to be that great, but we're from Louisiana, so...
So our Cajun accent is going to be better than 99% of the world. I gotcha. All right, so that's audio quality, host likability. Let's talk about production values. Pretty minimal. Music in and out, that's about it. There's really nothing else to it. There's not any bumpers or sound effects, were there?
No, yes.
There were?
Yeah, they do some recordings. They'll do some recordings from maybe it's some news audio or whatever it is. They do drop audio in,
but there's not there's not the soundboard there's not the guy.
Right. It's not the radio
making
zoo.
the sound
it's not
effects from Adam Crow.
Right. And I think that's probably because you listen to a lot of the later episodes or a lot of the interview episodes. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of shows that do interviews, but generally that interview takes up the whole show.
Or 3/4, like 5/8 or something, a lot, most of it.
Right. Even with the Miss Pat interview, it was a great piece of the show, but it wasn't what that whole show was about. Like, they still do their thing.
Well, I think if this show is going to continue, if they're looking to build an audience for them specifically, and it looks like they're doing a good job of that already. They're doing it in exactly the right way. They're using those interviews to pull. The fact of the matter is, when we saw it in the email that they had interviewed Adam Carolla, it made it seem more legitimate. Well, when Travis followed up later and said they got a Miss Pat interview too, I was like, oh, okay, well, let's check these guys out. I had looked at them before and had them way off on the back burner, and I was drawn in, even me who's listened to a million podcasts, I was drawn in because of the interviews, and then I gave the rest of their show a chance. I think they're going to catch a lot of flies with that particular batch of honey. I think they should continue that format.
Yeah, no, that I agree. Like earlier, in this review, we talk about show finding its way. Mm-hmm. You know, people who are just not doing it, it takes a while to learn how to podcast. It takes a while to learn what your show is. And if they did more interviews, it didn't even have to be celebrities, because I think that the more interviews they do, the better they'll be at it. But I think breaking up the show with a 20-minute interview, they could do how to tap maple syrup. Right?
Well,
I would listen to 20 minutes of that and then let them do their thing around it.
It makes me think about, if we go back to the Sick and Wrong podcast and a couple of their interviews that were things like the man with the world's smallest penis,
the micro penis,
they had the guy who had started the wingman company, the professional wingman company. That was a fascinating interview, even though you didn't know the guy's name or had never heard of the thing before, you know, both of those cases. And these guys could do well and even have promotable audience drawing interviews, even though the interviewee isn't a marquee name. If it's an interesting concept like that, it's still something that you can promote, especially with social media. I think these guys can and will do a good job of that. It's obviously worked to a degree already based on the flood of emails that you and I got on new listeners for them, people who've come to love them recently based on this new growth and this new direction. I think Travis is probably to be commended for at least a good bit of that growth, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
All right, so we've pretty much summed this thing up. Let's start wrapping it up. Do you have any particular favorite moments or episodes that you want to point to people to? We talked about the Miss Pat interview and the Adam Carolla episode. Both of those are good jumping on points, I think, if you want to get a handle for what these guys do, and then you can dig deeper if you enjoy their banter. That would be my suggestion.
No, I mean, I already mentioned what tickles me every time with a schoolgirl's joy of them doing accents of other parts of Canada. Like every time, it just makes me smile, man.
Does this make you want to like dig deeper and find more Canadian comedy podcasts? See if this is like a whole new niche for you?
No, I feel like I listen to a tremendous amount of Canadian podcasts.
Do you really?
Probably more than. There's a lot out there. There's a lot out there.
Well, no, I know. Do you listen to as many?
Well, I guess, whenever you look at Chris Jericho, he is Canadian, and he does have a podcast.
That's a very good point. Do you listen to as many Canadian podcasts as I listen to
Australian or English podcasts?
Yes, if you'll give me both of them. I was trying to think of which I listen to more of. I listen to 2 Australian podcasts, 2 specific Australian podcasts, and I think I listen to a total of 5 UK podcasts.
I probably listen to the same amount of Canadian as you do UK.
That's a lot of Canadian shows for a guy from Louisiana. That's impressive.
And look, if we're honest, okay, you're going to have to lump Smodcast in as a Canadian podcast.
Smodcast is absolute. I was counting it as a Canadian podcast. Okay. Look, if Kevin Smith doesn't end up with a golden statue somewhere north of the border, it'll be a darn shame. And Scott Mosier, while he has American citizenship as well, will always be a son of the true North. So there you go, my friends. A little bit of a detour there, but those are our thoughts on The Last Gentleman podcast. You can find them at thelastgentlemanpodcast.com, or you can find them on Twitter as well at TLG Podcast.
I will say I wish they would change the name.
I do too, because they're not gentlemen. That is my biggest problem with the podcast. I understand it's ironic, but it's not ironic. It's just bad.
What's hard to 99% of the people who see the title of your podcast are only going to see the title of your podcast. And so when somebody clicks on it to listen to the Last Gentleman podcast and it's not what they thought that it was, that in itself can just be a turnoff. Even if they would give the show 2 or 3 episodes to get into it, just because of that, I feel like listeners are lost.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. Hey, you know what we ought to do before we wrap this thing up? Why don't we tell people what our rating is? We rate things here on Pod on. We rate shows on Pod on Pod with earbuds in. We don't give it stars. We don't give it thumbs up. We talk about earbuds. You can get 0, you can get 1, you can get 2. Josh, what are you going to give The Last Gentleman?
I've taken a lot of flack about my rating system and how I rate things.
It's because it's weird.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. This is the first podcast we've come across in how many episodes now?
Like 41.
in 40 episodes that makes me question how I rate things. Because typically, a 0 earbud's not bad. It's just I'm ambivalent toward it. It doesn't get me excited in any way. A half earbud is a show that I absolutely loathe. 1 earbud is a show that I'm going to continue to track and follow for whatever reason. 1.5 is one that I will suggest to other people. And a 2, I'm listening and preaching the gospel for every episode. I have become invested in this show, and I think solely because I've done a show similar. And particularly, I want to see how Kevin transitions. I want to see how he evolves. I have a personal investment in it at this point. Don't know who I would suggest it to, because there's just so many other podcasts out there currently like it that I'll get to before I ever get to suggesting this one. It's just, there's so many out there like it. It's just further down the list for me. I don't hate it, so it's not a half. It's not a 0. I don't think it is the level at which I have rated some other shows a 1. But for all intent and purposes, I'm going to have to give this show a 1.
Is it like a 1 with an asterisk, a 1 under protest?
I may not listen for 20 episodes, but I'm going to check in.
I got you.
Like, I want to see where it goes.
For me, the thing that you and I most agree on is I find it hard thinking who I'm going to suggest this show to. It does fall in behind so many others in just about any particular direction that I could think of a potential listener coming to me and going, hey, what's a podcast for me? I like these things. It obviously is building its audience, and it's definitely moving in the right trajectory. So I don't think it's something to dismiss, and I don't think it's something to overlook. I didn't hate it as I imagined I was going to when I started. And over the course of the 3 episodes, I was like, I see where these guys are going. I see why somebody is behind it. I see why people fall into it, and they get it. And because of that, I'm going to give it a 0.5 with like a upward facing arrow. Like, I think it has
like the stock is going to rise.
Yeah.
Like if this was a stock, you would buy it now because you're going to buy it's low. You're going to buy low and you're going to have faith that it's going to eventually get there. And I think this show will eventually evolve. It's not there yet. I think it has good things I think it has a good direction.
Yes.
But this show could, if it gets stagnant, it will die.
I think this show could possibly end up like yours and my first show did, where it hatches into something else entirely. It's not that the show evolves and is whittled down into its perfect form. It's that it literally begets a cousin somehow, or these two guys go their separate way at one point and they both end up in different shows that are more precise and honed and better than they ever would have been because of where this comes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go, Pokemon. It's the Pokemon of podcasts, folks, or could be someday anyway.
That's I'm going to patent that theory, the Pokemon effect.
All right.
Of podcasting.
It's The Last Gentleman Podcast. You can find them at thelastgentlemanpodcast.com. Very quickly, we've got a little bit of listener feedback. This is some cool stuff because it is actually in response to our history podcast. We just recently discussed the 3 great shows, Angry History, the Hardcore History show with Dan Carlin, and then also Stuff You Missed in History Class. And Stuff You Missed in History Class had some answers for us on Twitter. This is from, you can find them on Twitter at Missed in History. Stuff You Missed in History, Pod on Pod, to answer your cue. Most of our show, pre-April 2014, has been recorded in the same studio as Stuff You Should Know. Since April, it's still sometimes both of us in that studio, but often it's Holly there and me elsewhere, each recording a separate digital file with a good Google Hangout running so that we can see each other and interact. The microphones and recorded formats in both locations are identical, and our producer, Noel, merges the files together by magic. That comes from Tracy.
And that's the way, several podcasts that do it that way, that's the way to do it.
The show that we're going to discuss next week, Hello Internet, does a very similar thing. They've actually got a blog post up about it. You and I were discussing before we started this recording tonight. We'll tell you more about that next week, but it takes more work that way. Don't doubt it for a minute. but it shows. And as we talked about in that episode, the history episode, Stuff You Missed in History Class, a great recording, even though those two ladies are in separate studios or separate locations.
You could never tell.
Would never tell. So that's a little bit of listener feedback there. We've got some more from Nick Varney, but we're going to go ahead and talk about that next week as we're already running a little late. And I want to mention this. Cool thing happened on Facebook last week. So I'm promoting this episode. We're going to be reviewing The Last Gentleman, and I put that out on our Facebook page, and I tagged what I believe to be, I was doing this on my phone, I tagged on Facebook The Last Gentleman's Facebook page.
Was not the podcast.
It was not the podcast. It was a band called The Last Gentleman from Germany, which blew my mind. Since then, I have discovered there are a million The Last Gentleman bands, especially. There's several different ones. But these guys are actually really, really great. I had a great conversation with, and I'm going to do it wrong. Let me go find the... I had a great conversation with Consti Smith. I believe that's right. Let me make sure that's right. No, it was there and it went away. Where are you going? No, Consti McSmith. Consti McSmith and I were messaging back and forth. They sent us a song off of their album Pricks and Gents by The Last Gentleman. And the name of this song is called Grave Lines, and it is off of that album. You can check them out on Bandcamp too by searching The Last Gentleman. You got anything else to add this week, Josh? Anything else, Josh, before we wrap up this week's episode?
No, I think we did a good job this week. And if you didn't think that we did a good job this week, or you think we did a better job than just good, let us know.
Yeah, you can reach us at podonpod@teamprocreate.com. You can find us at podonpod.com. You can find us in iTunes and Stitcher. Give us ratings and reviews there, or pass us on to a friend that's just discovered podcasts. We'll help them find their new favorite show, just like we did for you. Until next week, I'm Joel.
I'm Josh.
And this has been Pod on Pod.
Are you wanting something funny? Are you wanting something smart? So on astral projection or the history of art? Do you want to learn a language or how to play guitar? Just leave it up to Joel and Josh. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Pod on Pod is a proud member of the Procast Network, a Procreate production. Procreate is a community of artists in film, music, the digital arts, and fine arts that helps them connect and collaborate on projects. You can find out more at teamprocreate.com. For more great podcasts from the Procast Network, check out Movie Buzzed. Every week, your host, Zach, and some special guests review a new film. It's time for good friends, a great movie, and a good buzz. The Pod on Pod theme song was written and produced by Adam Dale. You can find more information about him on our website. Our musical guest this week is The Last Gentleman.
Never ask you when and why you leave. I wait, you'll see. I called you once, I called you twice to leave. But since I heard the message, I started to retreat. I remember a time with cigarettes and wine, bloody checks and laughter all the time. I've never been so drunk and clean-minded at a time. You never asked me to walk with you the line. For my car, I answered that you should not drive too fast. You mentioned that velocity makes free. smiled and tended over the peace springing key. I remember a time with cigarettes and wine, bloody jokes and laughter all the time. I've never been so drunk and clean-minded at a time. You never asked me to walk with you the line.
A young man has died after a tragic car crash last night. The 19-year-old lost control of his car after overshooting a curve due to excessive speed. Witnesses called an ambulance, but the driver was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. Fortunately, no one else was involved in the accident.
Remember a time with cigarettes and wine, bloody jokes and laughter all the time. I've never been so drunk and clean-minded at a time. You never asked me to walk with you the line.